Good evening, everybody. My name is Bert Dicht. I am Vice President of Membership for the National Space Society. And on behalf of Larry Ahern, Vice President of Chapters, I'd like to welcome you to our Space Forum this evening, Farming in Space for Future Space Settlements, not just Glop and Salad. Probably one of the most interesting names we've had or titles we've had for a Space Forum. So I do want to thank you as always for joining us. And it's a great program that we have for you this evening. I always like to present a little bit about our agenda coming up. We'll talk very briefly about some virtual etiquette, our few announcements, the upcoming space forums, town halls, and then we'll go right into the program, and then we'll close for the evening. As always, in terms of the virtual etiquette, we do suggest you submit questions using the Q&A function. That way, those questions go right to our speaker, and it's easy to track them and follow them along. You can certainly put questions into the chat, but remember the chat can be seen by almost everybody. So I ask you to be respectful of the panelists and the audience. I did get a lot of questions submitted beforehand for our speaker this evening, and we're trying to get to as many as we can, but we do welcome you to submit questions as the presentation goes along. And just a suggestion, if you'd like to view the session in speaker mode, that way it highlights who is speaking at that time. So I'd like to start off with what is new. I shared this last week during our Space Forum, but I just wanted to re-emphasize it. Our NSS Career Center is actually now live. You can go in and sign up and put your resume in. NSS members get an advantage, so you can go in using your Inside NSS logon directly. If you're not an NSS member, you would need to just register with the site. But we're going to be adding and building and getting new jobs there. So it's really an exciting time, obviously, to be in space. In the space business as well, and we're hoping that we can make a big impact with this career center. Also, I remind you that we've got complete access online to the New Space Journal for space entrepreneurs. Again, you would access that through Inside NSS. So I encourage you to take a look at those things. Always, I like to say, if you'd like to give to our cause, you know that our funding comes, of course, from you members and the generous donations from people like you. So if you enjoy the programming that we're doing with these space forums, I encourage you to make a donation to support NSS at go.nss.org/donate-now. And thank you in advance for any donations you make this evening. Once the session is over, please complete the post-Space Forum survey. It only takes a few minutes to complete. And it's anonymous, and the feedback really helps us in planning future events. So let's talk a little bit about what's coming up next. Next week is another big session we have, the prize winners of the NSS MMARS contest. And it's kind of a connection to what we have here about a food and nutrition plan for a flight to Mars. We've got two student presenters and a NASA presenter as well. So it's going to be very, very interesting. We are still looking about what we're going to be doing in December 2nd. We're looking at this point a space year in review. That's tentative. We've got some other ideas, so we're still working on that. We've got a number of NSS activities in November. That's why we're only planning the one space forum next month. So, and we've got big plans for 2022. So stay tuned for all that. So now I'd like to get into our program. And I think what's interesting about tonight's session is we've always touched on technology. When you think about space travel, space settlement, we've had lots of discussions about rockets and other technologies that will be needed to ensure astronauts can make these journeys and we can build these settlements. But one of the things we've never really talked about is how do you feed all these people? And I think tonight's program is kind of interesting, relating to farming in space for the future. And our speaker tonight is Bryce Meyer. Bryce is a member of the NSS Board of Directors, our Region 4. He comes as actually a farmer. So that brings a lot of experience, but he's an engineer. He's got a degree in biology as well, and a lot of practical experience, again, with earth farms. So he's working on a textbook on the topic of space farms. He's done numerous publications in AIAA and, of course, at NSS conferences, and has also worked on some children's STEM books as well. So it is a great pleasure to have him here tonight to talk about something he's really interested in, and I think you will find it just as interesting. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to you, Bryce, and I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Okay, Bryce, it's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you. So hopefully I can live up to my billing. Like Bert says, my day job is definitely in engineering, but my vocation is sort of this concept of space farming. So my background, in case you're curious, is yes, I have a degree in engineering, I have degrees in biology, right? A graduate degree in biology in particular. But honestly, growing up, I spent lots of time on farms. Right, so my grandparents actually had a working 200-acre farm. My great uncle has a dairy farm, right? And then I've spent time working with people who grow shrimp and fish in various types of ponds and raceways. And myself, I've done lots of work with bioreactors, like using algae, just tanks of algae and closed cycle systems with fish and algae. So that's sort of where my background's from. I've even grown a crop of freshwater prawns before in my basement, but I no longer do because my wife would not tolerate that. So anyhow, that's sort of my background. If I can get it to go forward one here. So what is a space farm? Right. So tonight I'm really going to talk about sort of defining this rough term of space farming in general. And then also some of the technologies that sort of roll into this, and really some of the trade-offs that lead you to a menu that's better appetizing than just glop, right? So space farms, at least in this sense, are combinations of machinery and biology that recycle air, water, and waste from the human habitat to produce oxygenated air, clean water, and food. So what this means is a space farm is essentially a combination of a chemical factory and all the farming technologies we already have on Earth. So vertical farming, aquaponics, hydroponics, soil farming, and different combinations of those to get different results. And so the gist of a space farm is that you have this human habitat, which is where the humans live, right? And then inside the habitat, yes, there's some recycling of the air using condensers, right? Because most of the water that you bring in comes right back out of your water and your body in breath and sweat. So yeah, there's some of that. But you also release a lot of carbon dioxide. You release a lot of dirty water and waste. And then eventually those cycle back to come back to you as oxygen, food, and water by going through the space farm. There we go. Make it a little more visible. Okay. So what drives a space farm, right? So we've already said that a space farm is a combination of machinery and biology, a bunch of crops and machines. Oops, sorry. What drives space farm design? So really, the farms get bigger if you have a large human population, because now you have a lot of mass you already have to deal with, right? You have a lot of if you have more enclosed volume and area to deal with, then that gives you more menu options. The availability of usable carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, or the con elements, and water, right? So if you have a lot of available stuff, like you're on Mars and you can compress a lot of carbon dioxide out of the air, that helps you get more diverse in your farm. Another big driver is the availability of energy. So if you have lots of energy, you can do lots more things with the farm. And then farms evolve over time. You might start with a small space farm. As your settlement grows, your farm grows, right? Or over time, maybe you start producing a bigger farm. And really, one of the big drivers for what you grow in that farm is the menu diversity and dietary requirements of the people who are going to be using the results, whether you're selling the outputs or whether you're keeping them at your settlement, right? So the more crops you have, the more menu options you can have, right? The more things you can eat, the more less bland and boring your menu becomes, right? So these are things that drive what happens in a space farm. So let's talk about what a space farm is. Well, you notice on here, the traditional agriculture things are really in this bottom left corner, right? So the bottom left form, you've seen the hydroponics and aeroponics and soil farming, and that's what most people think a space farm is just a garden. Well, no, right? If you want a diverse menu, you got to get a little more adventurous than that. Even if you're a bunch of vegans, you're still going to probably have to do some cellular culture, a bunch of fermentation. You're still going to have to deal with waste processing. And as a result, all these machines along the upper right and along the top now become things, right? And it's not just the machinery, it's the way you connect those machinery. So everything you've heard about when you hear about the terms like SCADA, where you talk about these big control systems that control pipelines and chemical factories and refineries, those are in play for a space farm. In order to implement a space farm, you are going to bring in all those chemical factory kind of functions and put them in the space farm, because in the space farm, the mass must flow. The idea is that the mass flows out of the settlement through and inside the farm and eventually back to the settlement. So in a space farm, everything deals with flowing masses, right? And if that means if you have to make mass flow, whether it's a bunch of fluids or a bunch of air or a bunch of solids, you're dealing with machines. You're dealing with pumps, you're dealing with tanks, you're dealing with computers and sensors to control the whole thing, valves, and all those kinds of technologies. Now, if you start dealing with animals, you have that stuff down to the bottom too, maybe insects, maybe mini livestock, maybe birds, maybe other animals, right? But the bottom line is there is a job in space farming for pretty much any expertise out there, even if you just want to eat algae. So a space farm is a lot more than a garden. Talk about the people, right? So this is loosely from the NASA handbook. And really the whole reason I bring this up is the fact that you'll notice there's some ins and outs from the humans, right? A lot of ins and outs. Loosely, it adds up to about 6 kilograms plus or minus, right? If you add up all the ins and outs together. So as I said, the space farm takes the outputs of the human habitat, eventually returns it back in clean water, oxygen, and food, what I affectionately like to call the poop to plate paradigm, right? So everything that comes out eventually comes back. As I said, some recycling happens in the habitat. So even in the ISS right now, you have dehumidifiers that take your breath and sweat, which is the bulk of your water output, and send it back in, right? So that's no big deal, right? That water is going to be recycled over and over again, right? Now, what gets flushed down the toilet might be a different problem. But something I want to point out is the farm doesn't have to be separated from the habitat. There should be elements of the farm in your habitat. The house plants for the habitat of the future for settlements will be things like spices, like bush plants, right? Why grow a plant if you can't eat it, right? Why do that? And the other reason is plants not only provide a psychological benefit in their coloration, but they clean the air and make it smell better. And anybody who's been to the ISS, not me, but I have friends who have, can tell you that it does not smell good. And so one of the things you're going to do is take some of your gray water, pump it through a little bit of hydroponics for spice plants in the corners inside your habitat. And as a result, your corner of your habitats are going to be green, right? Because this is the first piece of your space farm. Your space farm is going to be part of your habitat, and that's where your spices come from to spice up your dinner. However, there's the other kind of water. So that's the gray water. So that means hand washing water, leftover water that's beyond what the humans actually create a little water as part of metabolism, right? When you eat your food, a little bit of extra water comes out because that's part of the breakdown of sugars and carbohydrates. So some of that water is going to end up in the farm. Some of that water is going to end up cycling through the plants, right? The gray water and some of that condensed water. Everything gets flushed though. So human waste, urine, any other organic contamination needs to be treated. You're going to have a waste treatment methodology that's sort of the entrance point into the farm. And the reason I also bring it up here is because inside the farm, you're going to have to deal with waste too. So yes, your carbon dioxide from you is going to go into the farm if it's not used by area and habitat plants. And you can concentrate out the CO2 from the air using things like cryopumps, right? So cryopumps are a way to separate carbon dioxide from the rest of the gases due to the fact that carbon dioxide freezes before all the other gases do, right? So you can actually use something like a cryopump, concentrate out the carbon dioxide, into the farm it goes. This whole thing needs a little dose of biochem. So I think most people learned this in high school probably, but if you didn't, the thing is that your inputs are the same as a plant's outputs, roughly, right? So the carbon and oxygen, carbon gets broken out in a, let's say start on the human side or the animal side over here. Oxygen goes into you, right? Carbon comes from your food, comes out as carbon dioxide, goes back to the plants or algae, right? Same cycle, water goes into you, waste go out with the water, back to the plants. And then your food has nitrogen in it, that's part of your wastewater. And anything that you have with growth happens inside you. Now, a lot of my space farm assumptions, I assume that humans don't grow, right? They don't gain any weight, or on average, the settlement averages out, right? That's just a good assumption. But let's say you're growing animals, well, that growth obviously now becomes part of your food base. Plants, on the other hand, when they do photosynthesis, so they take carbon dioxide, oxygen goes out, the carbons get accumulated in the plant, and so does the water. So the water, nutrients, and the carbons from carbon dioxide end up accumulated in the plant or algae as a one-way, essentially a one-way function, right? Plants, if they photosynthesize, must grow. They have no other, that's just how photosynthesis works, right? Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and water, makes sugars, right? Which essentially makes more plant. So it's a one-way function. So this growth now becomes our food, but it can also create a problem. Here is the problem. So you do not exhale enough carbon dioxide to feed yourself. You can't. So all these fanciful things where it's just a human in a garden, you're dead. After a couple cycles, you die. Right? That's just the math. That's just the way the math works out. You do not exhale enough carbon dioxide to feed yourself, and here's why. So you take in oxygen, you take in water, right? The water cycles inside the habitat with those dehumidifiers and runs it back around to you, right? That's wonderful. There's some net water that you take in, you know, maybe that ends up coming out from over here after you've cleaned it. But really, you have a lot of things that you produce as dry waste, and you produce wastewater. So if I dehydrate your poop and your urine, you end up with some dry waste, and that somehow is a pile of waste down here. So let's think about that. We'll leave that there for now. But let's just say we go to the garden. The CO2 required to produce enough calories for you is 1.5 times the CO2 from your breath. So that means everything that you grow in the garden produces usable carbs, fats, and proteins, right? And if you're talking animals, they produce fewer carbs or no carbs and no fiber, right? But carbs, fats, and proteins, ash, and fiber are the dietary components of every food that you take in. Well, if you grow a crop in the garden, you also have these inedible parts that aren't part of your crop. So let's say you grew a potato plant, an annual potato plant, for example, like I'm growing out in my backyard here, right? The stalk and all that stuff is not something you eat. You might feed it to cattle maybe, but you ain't eating it, right? So there's a lot of the plant, regardless of even animal crops, there are parts that are inedible, right? So the garden takes in the CO2 because we already talked about photosynthesis. It takes in water. It gets distributed in growth to all these different components right away. Inedible parts, boop, out of the system. There goes some of your carbon. The fiber in the plant, so usually called cellulose, right, goes through you and right through you and ends up in waste. Ash, some of it gets incorporated in you because it's minerals and stuff like that, but a lot of that also ends up in the waste. You pee it out mostly. And so as a result, this little fraction down here is lost to the cycle. You didn't do anything to treat it or break it back apart again. Gone. So after a few cycles in your garden, even if you had enough carbon dioxide to start with to grow the first couple crops, eventually it all gets chewed up in the cellulose and you're SOL. You're out of luck. So you must do something with all those wastes. You have to crack them back open to get the CO2 and water back out to make the cycle actually work. So that's the carbon cycle problem. There's one way to do that. So one of the ways to do that is to use a thing called a bioreactor. So we use bioreactors all the time. A cow's guts are a bioreactor, right? And all a bioreactor is a combination of living cells and machines. In the case of a cow's guts, the machine is the intestines. And in the case of soil, which is another kind of bioreactor, it's a bunch of different organisms and the minerals that make up the soil, right? But in the commercial world, the way you got your beer and wine, bioreactor, right? The way you digest your waste out of most septic systems, a bioreactor. Use them all the time. They also use them in the pharmaceutical industry extensively to produce pretty much every pharmaceutical you take in addition to pesticides and everything else. So it's a common thing on Earth. So bioreactors are cells and machines designed to make some chemical that you want, right? And the cells that can be in there can be, you can use algae cells, you can use bacteria cells, you can use cyanobacteria, otherwise known as blue-green algae, and you can use funguses like yeast, right? So already happens on Earth, it's an existing machine, right? The special kind that you're probably going to need to break up that waste is called an aerobic bioreactor. And what that does is it takes oxygen and takes the input, which is whatever waste it is, and makes carbon dioxide and water. It just cracks it open, and now the CO2 is back in the system, and we've closed that carbon cycle. So the downside of bioreactors is it takes a lot of space. You have to have a tank. You might even get fancy and have a membrane-based bioreactor where the organisms are attached to some fancy machinery, and they're attached to some like cool membranes and wrapped around there. So that might be the fancy way of doing it, slightly smaller. But the downside is, of course, it's a bigger thing than maybe using an incinerator. But aerobic bioreactors are going to be key to making the space farm actually close its loop. Has to have it, right? The other kind you're probably familiar with is if you ever drink or eat any algae products is a photobioreactor. So a photobioreactor, instead of being an aerobic reactor where it takes in oxygen and inputs and puts out CO2 and water, a photobioreactor is the reverse, where it takes inputs from carbon dioxide and water, and it might take in some nutrients like, urea or ammonia from urine, for example, and it creates biomass, more living algae and oxygen. So photobioreactors, you do that with light. Right, so bioreactors are the reverse of an aerobic bioreactor. So one produces yeast and lots of carbon dioxide and water, and one takes in carbon dioxide and water and makes biomass and oxygen. So it sort of looks like this. So let's go back to the waste management problem we were just talking about. So in the habitat, you might actually use an incinerator. You might not necessarily use a bioreactor, but you probably are at least going to have a settling tank, right? You flush the toilet, goes into the settling tank. All the waste get chewed up by some kind of macerating pump, end up in the settling tank. Solids end up in the incinerator. Some of the gases end up in the incinerator. Maybe you siphon the liquids off and use them to your farm. But you have a trade-off that you make between using a settling tank and an incinerator and using just a series of bioreactors. So the reason I bring this up is that in the habitat, you're probably going to lean more towards the incinerator because it's quicker and it sterilizes everything as a product. In the farm, the waste that run around inside the farm, you might want to go with the bioreactor side. And if you notice, I attach these other machines on the sides of the bioreactor. That's the same as this other column over here. That is a condenser column. So the output is still CO2 and water. You can condense out the water, leaving the CO2 rich air. So quick gas separation without a whole lot of effort. So let's say what the simplest farm is. So let's assume you just had to get by, right? You were just on a mission going to Mars, and you really weren't overly, maybe you had some really fancy 3D printers, and you had this big stock of spices, and it's like, okay, I just need to get by, right? I need enough to just recycle everything around and give me enough calories to survive, and we're really tough, and we can handle a really bland diet. Oh, here's your Glop and Salad scenario. So in this scenario, the food waste goes into the yeast bioreactor, which is an aerobic bioreactor. You get yeast back, and you get the CO2, which goes into the CO2 part of the system. The waste that you release get UV sterilized into the waste digester, which is just a big tank and an aerobic bioreactor. The waste go into the waste cycle. Waste go into, once they're sterilized, go into the algae bioreactor or the garden as needed to be by your control system. The garden produces cleaned water through the roots, and the algae bioreactor produces algae for you to eat, along with the yeast and an occasional garden product. As a result, your diet is the wonderfulness of Glop and Salad. So this is the smallest one, and you can implement, it's amazing how small this could be. So by my kind of calculations, you could support 100 people in the area of my little 2-bedroom, 2-bath house using just bioreactors and a small garden. Right? You have some tomatoes, you know, maybe some bell peppers, you know, that kind of thing. Maybe a couple other plants here and there, maybe some soybeans if you really want to get fancy, but probably not. Maybe some potatoes more likely, right? And some simple hydroponic garden. And your diet's mostly yeast and algae, right? With some little salad on the side, right? And as I said, you could implement this garden for about 100 people in the size of a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house. So you can do it. Not a great diet, but you can do it. Here's a more balanced menu, but I want you to note something as I go through. So let's just say I added a different set of crops here. So let's say I added a fish tank, and I got some tilapia, right? And as a result, now I've got the aquaponics scenario. And the reason I bring up the tilapia is this. If I have a photo bioreactor, which produces lots of algae, instead of me eating the algae, it turns out tilapia and shrimp grow really, really fast and energy efficient by eating algae. So I feed the algae to them. Their wastes now become perfect fertilizer for my hydroponic garden, right? And now you have a thing called an aquaponics system, you know, where the waste from the tilapia, the nutrient-rich water that comes out of the tilapia's urinary tract, gets cycled through the roots of all these plants and makes them grow faster. So the algae go to the tilapia. I maybe grow some arugula, which is a great lettuce. I grow it all the time, grows really fast, about 7 to 10 days to get a crop, right? You can snip it constantly until it finally dies. You grow a rice, right? You can grow rice and it takes about 3 to 4 months. You can grow pinto beans, and things about beans is beans are very tough crop. They're very tough and they grow very fast. So they can actually take a lot of beatings. So beans are actually one of the crops that I would strongly recommend, right? Pinto beans especially. They grow very quickly. And here's the interesting thing about pinto beans. You can mess with the light cycle all you want. So you can go 12 on, 12 off, 4 on, 4 off, an hour on, an hour off, like, oh, let's say the ISS, right? 45 on, 45 off, right? And it turns out they still grow. I've grown them in my basement, done it 100 times, grow great, right? Pinto beans are wonderful like that. So pinto beans are a nice protein-rich crop you can grow. And of course, tomatoes. And in this case, the tomatoes are the perennial type. So if you have perennial tomatoes, you don't have to mess with a whole lot of weird trimmings and things. You get a little bit of trimmings, but you get a lot of fruit for your effort. So pinto beans, tomatoes, rice, arugula, tilapia. What happens, right? So that comes up with a full balanced diet, a whole daily diet for my habitat, right? The thing you need to note is, okay, there's a teeny bit that comes off arugula. Almost all of arugula is really edible. But there's a lot that comes off of rice, right? So if you notice, the dry grain out of rice is about 1/4 kilo versus 1/2 kilo of stalk, roots, leaf. So keep that in mind when we go to the next piece here. So pinto beans, sort of the same thing, right? About 4/10 kilo for the bean and about 7/10 kilo for the parts that aren't the bean. So the stalk, the leaves, the roots, right? Tomato plant, it's almost balanced because as it grows tomatoes, it grows a couple extra leaves and you can snip the leaves or sort of leave them on there, your call if you have enough room, right? So that's not quite a problem, but the reason I point these out is these become mass flows inside the farm. So the more complicated the farm is, the more waste treatment inside the farm as part of the mass flow you have. Right? The farm's mass flow inside of itself becomes bigger than anything that comes from and to the habitat because it's a diverse farm. So especially if it's very plant rich, you actually have a larger mass flow and waste treatment with the aerobic bioreactor thing going on inside the farm than dealing with the habitat. So like I said, the flow inside the farm gets bigger with a diverse crop than going between the farm and the humans. The humans are over here. You notice there's all these other things that happen, right? The solid waste from the fish go to the bioreactors, liquid waste go to the plants, the algae and some oxygen from the photobioreactor go up to the fish, you know, and you see the CO2 cycling back over the algae and up to the garden. So this will close your loop. That complicated menu here closes your loop and gives you a pretty complicated menu. It's also a lot larger than the other one. So that farm, for example, you looked at this one, is closer to about, you know, 3-4 acres for 100 people. Right, 3, 4, 5 acres for 100 people, depending upon how efficient you are. So I now need to talk about another concept. So traditionally on Earth, and if you're in the fall in the Northern Hemisphere right now, you're seeing this, right? Your soybeans and your wheat and your corn are all done, right? They dry out and then they get harvested, right? So 120 some odd days, 110 to 120 days after you plant wheat or corn or barley or soybeans, they grow, they die, you harvest them, and then you store the result for a year as you eat it, right? So that, I like to call that the Big Bang harvest, right? Where you're growing a long crop, you harvest it, and you store it. Well, that's great if you have plenty of room, like on Earth, you have these giant fields. So what? You have a big field, you're not going to grow anything in the winter anyhow, who cares, right? You can have a bunch of open area, and then you can have it open while the plants are starting to grow up, from little teeny plants up to big plants, right? Can deal with that because you have plenty of area. Well, in space, footprint or area comes at a premium, right? Because I have to enclose it from the harshness of the space environment, right? So whether it's on a free floating settlement, or whether it's on Mars or it's on the moon, right? I've got to enclose it all. And that is hard to do, right? That takes a lot of work to enclose a larger area. So if there's any tricks that I can use to essentially get the same number of calories every day and, oh, by the way, balance out, even out my mass flow, so that instead of that little exponential curve on the bottom left where it goes like this, so when early on there's almost no mass flow, later on it's ginormous, maybe I can level that out a bit too at the same time. Well, the trick for doing that is called continuous harvest. And you're already familiar with this if you have a tomato plant, right? Because if you have a perennial tomato plant, you're pulling tomatoes off of it all the time, right? You're continuously harvesting those tomatoes. You can do the same thing with grain. And so what you do is you cohort out, you set up a little window that says, for the first 30 days, grain's a little bitty, right? It's just a little teeny plant, looks like grass. There's a joke that says a guy walked up to a wheat farmer in May and said, yeah, I saw that overgrown grass in your field and I decided to cut it, and the farmer drops dead, right? Because that's what wheat looks like when you first farm it, right? It just looks like a bunch of overgrown grass that's maybe 6-7 inches high, right? So it's small. It doesn't take up much room. It doesn't take up much volume up for the first 30 days, right? The next 30 to 60 days, it takes up slightly more room, right? 60 to 90 days, again, more room. And finally, the last chunk before you'll harvest it, the last 90 to 100 days is where the big hunk of your room is taken up. So if you're slick, you can actually do a daily rotation thing where every 30 days, you take each plant grows in its cohort. It's 0 to 30 days or 30 to 60 days or 60 to 90 days. For 30 days, it grows into its area. And then you transplant it 30 days later to the next one. And then what you do is you have it so that you're pulling that wheat every day. You're pulling 1 day's harvest every day. And what that does is, even if you do it like this, where it's a 30-day, what I call it a cohort or a 30-day group, right? If you do that, you save at least 30% of the available volume and footprint. And there are ways to even make it far more efficient than that. If you could figure out a way to do it every day without killing the plants, you could get it down to 70% smaller than you would just by growing it with Big Bang harvest. But regardless, if you use continuous harvest even in this mode, you've now made the mass flow even. Predictable level every day. Certain amount in, certain amount out every day. And if you do that for all your crops, now you have fresh crops every day in the quantity you need that day. So continuous harvest is a thing, even for grains. So we've already sort of hinted at the soil versus soilless trade. So the thing about soil is great for chemical control, right? So soil is a wonderful thing. It's a mix of different organisms. It's a matrix of minerals and rocks and little stuff like that. And it has, and even at a minimum, has funguses and bacteria. And the funguses and bacteria are aerobic, ideally, right? And they do aerobic digestion in the soil. So they are essentially an aerobic bioreactor. But really, one of the big things they do is even out water flow, and they even out chemistry of the soil. So they act as a great buffer for your plant, and they make your plant more resistant to swings in chemistry or water. So that way you don't accidentally kill them when your chemical management system gets a software bug, right? So that's one of the upsides of soil. The downside is it just takes up a ton more room and volume, right? And so on the opposite side is aeroponics, where you don't have any matrix at all, right? You just have mist going on top of your roots. And you have a smaller area for that bacteria and fungus to grow, so you don't get the same kind of resistance to chemical problems. And oh, by the way, you're resistant to things like clogging, right? So there's different things in between there. You might use fibers, like they use diapers on the ISS for plants. You might use fine particles like sand. You might get the coarse particles like just rocks, like lava rocks, right? So there's a spectrum of where you would trade that off. It depends on the crops you're doing, what the resistance to chemistry is, and how much clogging you're willing to deal with as you make the different structures for going all the way from aeroponics through shallow water and deep water hydroponics all the way to soil, right? It's one of the engineering trade-offs you need to make. Some plants grow much, much better in dirt like soybeans, right? Soybeans, they really, really, really need that soil, that biome in the soil to grow well, right? Even if you're giving them all their nitrogen by injecting it into the soil itself, they really need it. I mean, you can grow them hydroponically, right? You can inject all their nitrogen hydroponically, right? But if you give them a little soil and then inject a teeny bit of nitrogen into the air, they'll capture it in the dirt, it's all good. So plants like soybeans really love soil versus some plants like tomatoes or arugula, you don't need anything. You can go straight aeroponics if you want, just because you feel like it, right? And a lot of the vertical farms in Europe use deep water hydroponics to grow their off-season lettuce and tomatoes. That's exactly what they do in Northern Europe, right? That's how they stock the shelves in the winter. So and here's a couple other trade-offs to consider. So if you're talking about plants, early plants, it's easy to grow tomatoes and things like that because you get something every day and you can grow it in a fairly small area, but you don't get a lot of calories. You get a lot of fiber, right? Legumes are really good for protein. They take a little longer to grow. Pinto beans especially, there's a real good one, right? And they're tough, but they take a lot of nitrogen input. Potatoes and your other root crops need some root volume, but you can get starches especially, and grains, of course, are your big high calorie producers, right? They are on Earth and they probably will be eventually in space. But to start with, you're really talking veggies, right? To get out of the gate with your teeny little farm, your teeny little settlement, you're going to have veggies and maybe some pinto beans. There's some other things you might consider too. So things like insects grow in a very small area. I know most of us with Western palates are not attuned to eating bugs. I've eaten several of them myself. I've grown crickets myself, right? So they grow in a very small area. They're pretty tough. That's not a bad one, but shrimp is better. So if you're going to go that route with an invertebrate, I strongly recommend using shrimp. And the reason I do is because they have a high protein conversion, right? They taste good and they have a high protein conversion. And in 3 months, you can go from this big a shrimp to this big a shrimp. Done it myself. Trust me, it works. The only thing is they don't, they're a little chemical sensitive, but they are. And some other things that you might not think of. So we all know about tilapia. How many people have thought about the fact that silver carp, which are a great invasive species all over the rivers near me, are a wonderful space farm candidate? And the reason is because one, you could actually feed them raw waste. So human wastewater, once sterilized, they can eat it. Two, they eat algae, so they get that nice, beautiful algae cycle I was talking to you about before. And three, they grow super fast, 1 inch a month. Silver carp are a tremendous space farm candidate if you're going to have any fish at all. Right? They take a lot of room in initial water, but accumulate proteins very well, especially if you can use the algae cycle. So if you have fish and shrimp, you're probably going to lean towards at least some part of your garden being hydroponic. Because that way, deep water or shallow water, either way, because you can pump the water through the roots to clean it and the plants grow faster. But let's not forget those herbs and spices and some other fun things like, oh, let's say coffee, right? So me, I'm a coffee addict. I love coffee. It's going to take you about 3 to 5 years to get that first coffee plant, but coffee is indeed doable in a space farm. It's just going to take you 3 to 5 years to really get that first plant. Now, if you're taking a year out to Mars, it'd be a good idea to bring a whole plant and grow it as you go out, so that eventually you get that first crop, right? You're not going to have a lot of coffee, but you could start growing bushes inside the habitat. And maybe if you feel real sporty, you can start talking about having a whole garden element of your space farm just to grow things like coffee. And the reason I bring coffee up too is it'd be a wonderful export crop. So if you're talking about an economic web of settlements, one of the easy agricultural products would probably be coffee that you could charge a lot of money for. So something to think about. But these other spices are things you can grow pretty fast, right? Sage, basil, mint, oregano, garlic, saffron, this whole list here. Everything but the hops you can grow fast, right? Inside of sometimes a few weeks to maybe a month or two. So you can get all these spices right away, which gives you a lot of menu options. Unfortunately, if you want beer, it's going to take 2 years. Sorry, right? If you want real beer. Now, if you want sake, that's a whole different story. That first rice crop, yes, you could ferment that out in one of your anaerobic bioreactors, so just a tank. I make it in my basement all the time, just saying. You can make sake pretty quick. But coffee and tea, it'd take at least 3 to 5 years. Some other things that you might not realize you're probably not going to get right away in a space settlement. So olive trees take 30 to 60 years to mature. Cinnamon, black pepper, nutmeg, and chocolate. So they take about a decade a pop. So those are things that you might be shipping from Earth if you happen to want them. Or you have a very mature colony that just plants way ahead and you've decided to grow them. Part of the game. So let's talk about some of the other things you might grow. Chickens. The trade-off for chickens, mass flow-wise, works out eggs better than cooking for meat. So you might make a few, if you decide you magically want to make a chicken cage somewhere, right? And you want to do chickens, one, you got to deal with the feathers. And two, you're going to probably have a lot more egg-laying hens. A hen on typical will lay 200 eggs per year, right? And that's a much better source of protein mass flow than trying to grow birds for meat use. The other thing is chickens can be shipped as eggs, just something to think about. Chickens have been genetically engineered over time, and they're far more efficient than ducks or geese or turkey. So if you're going to do a bird, it's a chicken, right? And if you're probably going to do a chicken, it's probably a hen. You're going to be laying eggs. Sometime in the very far future of a settlement, you might consider things like goats, right? And most of your goats are going to be milk goats to start with. Eventually, you might do something larger, like even, cattle or something like that. But if you have any big fantasies of growing a steak on Mars, it's going to take a very large settlement and a long time, right? You're going to have a large soil farm where you're growing grass or something like that for a long time before you start to bring in that first cow. So any fantasies of space of Martian beef, you might be waiting a long time. You could get rodents first, right? So if you could get guinea pigs, you could get nutrias, and I've done a lot of mass calculations on those, right? And their micro livestock for jumbo guinea pigs is big in South America. There's actually a big thing for them, right? And they can grow in a lot of different areas, and they're very volume efficient. But as far as mass flow goes, most mammals produce more gut than meat. And so you're going to have to find a way to deal with all those guts and bones if you want to make the mass flow loop close. So you don't just get the nice, juicy meat parts. You're going to get all these other parts that now you got to deal with too. So it might be a long time before you get mammals, right? So you're going to get birds way, way before you get a mammal. it looks something like this over time. So if you're looking at it over time, the easiest thing to start with is the cellular agriculture down here with the aerobic bioreactor and the photobioreactor, right? And then it's just a teeny hump above that is the arugula and things like that, tomatoes, your initial crops, right? Pretty quick. If you want to be really slick, you could do a mushroom garden too, right? Mushrooms take a month or two once you get them started, and you can grow them in a fairly small area and get at least some mushrooms, not a lot, but you'll probably get some, right? Not too hard, right? And insects, right? Those are easy. Shrimp are even better. So if you notice, shrimp are right on the primary axis here, and they go straight up to tilapia, and silver carp could be right here where the tilapia are. Something most people have probably not considered are mollusks. So if you happen to have, let's say, a fish tank in the future in your space farm, you might have a stage of that fish tank that goes through something that makes clams or snails. You already have the fish tank pushing through. You probably have some waste algae in it. You might as well get the filtering effect done too. So you might get a couple of them as a side dish and it's not your main, right? And on the plant axis, you'll notice you go through potatoes, eventually soybeans, and then long out before you get to grains, right? You get a lot of menu diversity by adding all those grains and all those soybeans and things, but you notice they're further up the chain, right? They're further out than the initial crops back here with the veggies. Way out, you're starting to talk about bush crops, and it'll be decades before you get trees. If you notice on the animal axis, yes, you get chickens before even rodents like rabbits, and even before you ever think about a milk goat. And things like predatory fish, like let's say salmon and trout, I would wait a long time before I would go with a predator fish of any type, right? You really want to focus on the herbivore algae-eating fish because it creates a nice, efficient mass flow. But way back here is the algae-eating fish and stuff. Way out to the right, you start seeing your predator fish and trees and large mammals. So you notice that the settlement is very mature over time, right? And then you're talking in this outer swath, decades. Versus back here, 3 to 5 years in this axis, right in the middle. And then back here, first 1-2 years, you have steady state. So anywhere from the soybean axis, cut a diagonal between the chickens and the fish, and back, first 1-2 years, you can do all that. And you can do it in a fairly small area. So let's say I have a 3-year-old settlement. Here's an example of what the calculations sort of look like, right? And so this is for 100 settlers. You're talking, 10 tons worth of stuff and about 7 hectares. And you could get all these plants, animals, and spices. If you have a 3-year-old settlement, then you could get this kind of structure with about 7 hectares, which is about 14 acres to most English people, right? Americans, 14 acres. Everybody else in the world, 7 hectares. Right, 7 hectares can get you this much in a space farm. And the mass flows are like I said, on the right. So that means you can do all kinds of cool menu options like this. So if you have a 3-year-old settlement, right, your menu options can look like this. Where your breakfast sort of has soy milk, barley, ginger, tea, maybe a little bit of coffee, right? Because in 3 years, you start getting the first couple beans from that tree. You can make horchata, right? You can make even a Bloody Mary. Because now I have potatoes and I have vodka, right? I can take any grain and turn it into vodka, right? Just saying. You can make puffed malted cereals, puffed rice cereals, barley porridge with beans, steamed sweet rice with ginger, soy egg substitutes. So this is all breakfast right here, breakfast and lunch items, right? You can even do some rice flour muffins, right? You notice I didn't really have any wheat in this, just barley and rice. But that still gives you a bread option, right? And same with potato bread, fried potatoes, fresh tomatoes, right? So this is starting to look a little more appetizing than that glop you saw before. And then as you can do before, you also have these too. So all those things you just saw here, plus all of this. You can do vodka stuff. You could actually make wines from algae, potato, or rice. Sake is a rice wine, right? Beer, kombachas. You make fish, because now we have fish and shrimp. So now I can make those with or without beans, rice, and tortillas. I can even make sausages out of the leftovers. So if I have fish or shrimp, Like the entire shrimp is actually edible, believe it or not, the whole shrimp is. The whole fish is also edible. Most people only eat the fillets, but I could take the fillets and take the rest of the fish and turn it into a fish meal, into a sausage. So sausage and soy, right? I can make soy sausages or fish sausages if you're leaning on the vegan side versus the not. I can do soy cheese, bean burritos, peppers, noodle bowls, spaghetti, fish meatballs, fettuccine, and of course, tilapia as sushi or sashimi, same with the cooked shrimp rolls and carp. Right? So just this level of stuff here in 7 hectares gives me an extremely diverse menu after about 3 years to hit steady state. So that tells you can go way beyond just eating glop and salad. 3 years, 7 hectares, and I can get you a much more diverse menu in our space farm and still recycle all the inputs and outputs from the habitat. No problem at all. Like I said, it's not the oxygen problem that gets you. It's that carbon cycle. And as I said, the mass flow is king. The mass must flow. So thank you for letting me bend your ear tonight. If you're wondering what the drawing is on the right, it's my giant vision for the future of space settlement, trillions of happy, smiling babies everywhere. So thank you. That's all I got.
Thanks so much, Bryce.
Stop sharing. There you go.
That was really fascinating. I have to admit, I learned quite a bit, and we did get a lot of questions that have come in, both in the chat and the Q&A. And of course, we got a lot that were submitted beforehand. But let me start with one about you, because when I think of people working aerospace and space, I have to admit, I haven't met too many who started talking about space farms. What got you interested in space farms?
Oh, science fiction, my friend, science fiction, right? So in addition to growing up with farms, like I said, I mean, I've spent summers hauling hay up the hay lofts in my grandpa's barn, and I can sort of feel the itch every time I talk about it, right? So I'm very familiar with farms, right? And the funny thing is, my grandpa is up there having laughing at me because none of his kids went into farming, and none of his grandkids went directly into farming, but it sort of looks like I am. So yeah, between that and knowing that the human species must expand or go extinct, right? And the fact that I just have an interest in how ecosystems and biology work, right? So my master's in biology deals with a lot of biochemistry, omics, bioinformatics, but also deals with ecosystems and populations, right? Which are critical for understanding how farms work. Now I have practical experience for getting my hands dirty, right? I've driven a combine, right? I know exactly what it's like to harvest stuff and grow stuff, right? But when you have to start talking about space, you start talking about the science fiction-y thing where you're talking about Heinleins, farms in the sky, or even science fact where you're talking about Gerard O'Neill's with these giant orbital settlements. I always wondered, how do they deal with the rest of the cycle, right? Because the rest of the cycle is not closed. How are you closing the cycle? It's not just a magic garden, right? There has to be something that closes it, and it's those bioreactors that got me interested. The other thing is fish. So I love fish. I like to eat fish. I've grown fish. I figured there's got to be a place for fish in a space farm. So there you go. That's how I got in.
Very good. That's a great story. In terms of just some of your knowledge, obviously you bring an engineering background, you bring a biology background, but what has helped you gain more knowledge within space farming? Is it a lot of your own independent research? Have you had any formal training in it? Just like to get an example of that.
So I actually had, in addition to, the biology degree, of course, helped greatly. And working on a farm helped greatly. I've read all of Gerard O'Neill's outputs from their different NASA stuff, and I've read a lot of NASA studies, so I'm sort of self-educated in some of this stuff. But a lot of my own independent research, trying to balance all the elements in mass flow, led me to some of the conclusions I've come up with, right? So I use a genetic algorithm to balance my crops, right? So that one you saw where it had all those crops for the 3-year farm, that actually came out of a large-scale genetic analysis that I used to calculate what the mass balance is. And it balances all the elements across from carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and then it balances water, and it balances the caloric output. and it makes sure that the mass flow works through the air to the side. So all of those things go into that large scale. It's written in Perl, actually, right? And then I collected all the data from different agricultural databases to come up with sort of an estimate of how the carbon flows in and out of these plants, because there's really astoundingly little data on it, right? On exactly how much carbon dioxide is needed to generate a plant to grow X amount, right? And all the inputs and outputs, because most people worry about growing the plant, but they don't necessarily worry about the closed cycle itself. So some of that you can actually reverse from nutrition data. And so I've done all of that, and that analysis has led me to a lot of these conclusions, right? Just that and some rule of thumb engineering and some of my own work growing stuff.
Great. Before I get to some of the questions that have come in now, let me just try to get a few that were submitted. So, and these more are relating to what NASA is doing or what, the plans might be. But one of the questions I thought was pretty interesting, during the Apollo program, they trained astronauts to study, in geology to study the moon. Do you see a similar type program to train astronauts in farming?
Heck yeah. Oh, of course.
Yep.
And it's not just farming. Remember, a space farm is a chemical factory too.
Right.
You are going to need control systems experts, and you're going to need botanists, and you're going to need some kind of, like a sewer engineers essentially. Right? You're going to need all three of those expertises to really get a space farm to work. Right? So it's a bunch of strange bedfellows. So the kind of stuff, like my brother is a chemical engineer, and he uses bioreactors to make pharmaceutical products. That's one of the things he does, right? Using control systems. And so you're going to need somebody like him, right? You're going to need those people, and you're going to need some kind of, expert in growing stuff, right? So yes, eventually you're essentially going to have to create like a space farm discipline.
Fabulous.
Right? And it's have to have all those different branchings off of there as an engineering discipline.
Is there a NASA center now that's actually focused in on space farming?
So NASA Ames does some, right? And there's a little bit down at Goddard. Arizona State has done a lot of work that relates to space farms for Antarctica. So remember, they grow fresh veggies in Antarctica right now at the pole, right? And they use it using the sleeve system. It's tremendously ingenious. So I've worked with them guys on it a lot. So NASA has worked on a lot of different plant growth methodologies. They actually at one time had a fully closed cycle, a giant hangar, right? And it actually collected a lot of good data on growing a lot of crops hydroponically and trying to close the cycle, but it sort of disappeared.
Right.
It was one of those that just they don't have the funding for. I mean, there's still Biosphere out there, right? And the Mars Society does a lot of work. High Seas is still out there, right? So I've worked with High Seas and the Biosphere people. I've talked to all those people, right? And so that work is still very much going on in addition to what Arizona State's doing. And then there is a lot of work in vertical farms and stuff that's at the commercial level that will play, right? That stuff, there is a lot of, that's maximized a lot of hydroponic development. And this one I'm going to hate to say, but I've talked to these people, right? So the people who grow the little thing that you either smoke or eat for pharmaceutical purposes, they have the most advanced sensors for determining the inputs and outputs of any plant I've ever seen, right? They use a sequence of cameras and infrared devices to do high calculated, high precision control of hydroponics. Right, and they have some amazing software for doing that, and it's beyond anything that's even in the agricultural world here, right? So,
wow, that's really
there is a lot of work that we will be able to pull in from, but there's still a lot of research that needs to be done. We need to actually figure out to close in plants and figure under different conditions and different gravities how plants grow, right? Some of that stuff is still very much a research area.
Are they doing that research now on the ISS?
Yeah, well, they're doing it in zero G, obviously, right? And
right.
they figured out that a diaper plant grows better than just about anything, right? So a diaper plant is one that has a little fiber box essentially, and then has a drip hose going in,
right.
and then has a fan to circulate everything around, right? And you're going to need something like that even in a space farm greenhouse. You're going to need something almost exactly, not necessarily just a diaper. Maybe you use a hydroponic or something, but you're going to have a growth chamber with a ginormous dehumidifier to deal with the transpiration from all the plants. just like you do from humans, where all of our water comes out of our breath, right, or out of our sweat. Plants are the same way. They take 100 times the water they incorporate into their tissues goes through transpiration. So if they take you grow a living kilogram of plant, it's cycled at least 100 kilograms of water going up through the roots, coming out the pores, and then you're going to have to condense it inside the same chamber and send it back through.
Fabulous. Let me get to a couple questions now that have come in because they're starting to pile up. So I want to make sure I get to some. So first question comes from Carl. Would you also include GMOs in space farming?
I'm gonna leave that up to the space farm engineer, whether they would do genetically modified organisms or not. But that might be a strategy. You probably are, even if you don't do direct genetic modification, you are probably at least going to selectively breed crops for each environment. Your Mars coffee won't be the same as your moon coffee, right?
Right.
It's that simple, right? Plants are going to grow differently in different gravities. And same with fish and other stuff, right? Other organisms will do the same, right? So even if you don't directly genetically modify stuff, you can also, you will have to selectively breed over time. So a GMO might be a shortcut, right? If we can know the conditions, then we might be able to quickly genetically modify different organisms to grow faster in the farm. And I'm not opposed to that. Now, in a yeast bioreactor, right, if I'm doing that aerobic bioreactor and I'm using yeast and bacteria, those typically are genetically modified already to work better inside the bioreactor under the conditions you give them. So that way you know exactly what the chemical products are out the other side. Those are typically already modified organisms, but you're mostly using those for waste processing. You're not necessarily going to eat them unless you're doing the glop thing, right?
Right. Jeff is asking what other fish would be good candidates for space farms? Trout, whitefish?
Trout, nope. Nope. I actually have a whole prezo on exactly what goes into fish, what fish work out best. So anything, it pretty much works like this. Anything that can eat algae and plant waste is a great candidate. So you've already talked about tilapia, silver carp, right? Even common carp, right? Pacu are a great one. And then narrow-toothed catfish from Africa. Right, so the narrow-toothed catfish, and then milkfish. If you want to deal with more of a saltwater system, milkfish become a very good candidate too. You can also talk about shad, things like that. But whitefish and trout, which are all salmonids, salmon and salmonids are predatory fish, right? And trout, you can sometimes get to eat a soy-based feed, but it's going to be more mass inefficient. Maybe it's an export crop and you're willing to do it. Or maybe even tuna. Like you can close, believe it or not, there are tuna farms, right? So in Panama, they actually farm yellowfin tuna, right? They can close the entire cycle on yellowfin tuna, but you have to grow a fish to feed the yellowfin tuna. So that's a lot more inefficient. So the more steps you have in the ecosystem, the further towards the pinnacle of the ecosystem, right? The more mass flow energy it's going to take to make it work versus something way on the bottom, like a shrimp or a tilapia or something that can eat algae. That's a lot more energy and mass flow efficient.
Next question concerns meat. What about lab-grown meat? How does that fit in? Should we be able to do that in the early settlement?
I consider that a bioreactor, and you most definitely could, right? So instead of just glop, you could theoretically grow lab-grown meats, but here's the problem with lab-grown meats is one, it's very chemically sensitive. So if you want to do it as a side dish, that's great. But if I'm going to depend upon lab-grown meat as my #1 chow, you better make damn sure you've got the most controlled culture ever, and you better have parallel cultures. Because even with the plants, I assume in a lot of my calculations always that you're going to have backups, right? Because things happen, just stuff happens. Micrometeorite hit, boom. It's like with that cohort thing you saw, I would recommend that those are actually somewhat isolated so that if you get a disease or a meteorite hit or something, you don't lose the whole thing, right? And with the lab-grown meat, it's subject to mutation, right? Because you are genetically modifying it to make it grow right? So it's subject to mutation, and it's subject to a whole lot of different factors that must be optimized for it to work. But I'd say if you can do it, I would like a steak as early as possible, sure.
Right. We've got one of our space settlement experts, Al Globus, has raised his hand. So I'm going to allow him to speak so he can ask you a question directly, if that's okay with you.
Perfectly okay. Me and Al have many long conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, you are my favorite space farmer by far.
Oh, thanks, Al.
The question I have, has anybody tried to breeding plants and animals in orbit?
I don't know. I don't know how much work they've done in actually breeding plants up on the ISS. I know they grow a lot of them, right? They've grown quite a few.
Yeah.
Right, and they've gotten pretty good at growing them, but I don't know if they've actually bothered trying to go multiple generations yet.
I do know they've done experiments, but they're doing experiments, not space farming, and tried to breed mice.
Right, yeah. Mammalian reproduction in 0G is a big unknown.
Yeah. Well, it turned out, if I got this right, that the breeding went okay. They got baby mice, but the baby mice were unable to latch on to the mother's teats, and they starved to death.
Mm.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's new to me.
Yeah. And I heard it many years ago, and I may have scrambled it a bit, but something along those lines happened.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I know that, and I know you proposed this in your free floating settlements, is that gravity is sort of a must for humans at some point. And my assumption for a lot of my space farm architecture ideas is that we will have gravity somehow. Even if it's 1/6 G, we have some kind of gravity. Now, the weird thing about gravity is you would know, and anybody else who's ever done any fluid work knows, is a settling tank that's this big on Earth is going to have to be like this on Mars, at least three times taller. And on the moon, a really tall, skinny one.
Very good. Thanks, Al.
My pleasure.
Okay, let me get back to some of the questions that were submitted. James asked, when you talk about the maturity of food production, isn't it more about the size of the human population?
So the human population does provide you a lot more waste options, a lot more poop, to make your plate out of, so to speak, right? So the size of the human population gives you a lot more mass to deal with initially, right? And I assume if you're going to set up a settlement, you're going to have food for those humans for a year as your crops sort of mature and your farm stabilizes through all the different cycles it's going to go through, right? But it gives you a lot more poop to deal with, and honestly, it just gives you a lot more people to help make it work. So I would imagine that, yeah, more people should lead to a greater diversity in menu, assuming you also have the enclosed volume to deal with too, right? Assuming that entails a lot more volume and a lot more energy to go with that. But you don't have to, right? You can actually make a very diverse farm if you have a lot of volume and a lot of energy, and you can get a lot of in situ mass or something. You could actually have a fairly small population and just have a really wild, diverse farm, or maybe a tourist farm, right? Where you have a resort with a small resident population and you have a lot of visitors. And then you use a lot of in situ mass to replace it and use the visitors mass too.
Very good. Let me get a few more, and then I'm going to also look in the chat. I know there are a number of questions that were put in the chat. So Jeff is asking again, how much of this could be fully automated versus how many people might you need to just run the farm?
Yeah, I've tried to think about that one. At a minimum, you're going to need some automation, at least for some kind. Some plants are not going to be wind pollinated, so you're going to have at least a robot with a paintbrush, right? Or a human with a paintbrush, right? So my cousins, for example, that was their summer job, right? Was detasseling corn and using a paintbrush to fertilize the corn to make seed corn. So that would require a lot of manual effort, but if you could make a robot to do it, a drone, oh wow, that would be wonderful. And a lot of the farm, I think, could be set up robotically, right? There's no reason you couldn't set up a large percentage of this hydroponic farm running robots and seeds out ahead of time and then have the humans arrive later, right? So there's no reason, if you didn't have some very sophisticated robots, that they could, set up at least the hydroponic stuff, which is pretty simple, right? Setting up a bunch of trays and enclosed volume, they should be able to do that, right? Setting up the bioreactors and stuff, if it's already pre-made, then they should be able to do that, right? If you pre-made it, the whole thing, and put the cultures in there, then you could start talking about at least having remotely operated robots set that up too. But I mean, I would envision robots would be great for at least like digging out a lava tunnel or making the enclosed volume to start with, and then maybe starting to make the pieces of the hydroponic farm. Now, the problem with robots, of course, is they're not intelligent enough to deal with some of the weirdness that can happen, right? Farming is problematic even on Earth, even under the best tools and the best stuff you ever have, right? There's just weird stuff happens. So robots can help you set it up and they might get you going, but eventually humans are going to have to be involved, right?
Absolutely. This next question I love. It's not about your farming expertise. Is how did you produce all those great diagrams?
Oh, actually, so it's sort of funny. So I illustrate a bunch of my children's books are actually illustrated initially with PowerPoint. So I self-taught myself over the years on how to draw using OpenOffice Draw and PowerPoint. So I actually draw fish commercially. So if you actually go out there, so I don't just draw diagrams for children's books, right? I actually draw biologically accurate fish and sell them on cloth and stuff. It's like a side business. And I draw them, believe it or not, in OpenOffice Draw. So OpenOffice Draw is sort of my favorite for detail work. And then for diagrams, I still rely on PowerPoint. And then since I've done so many over my lifespan, I've just gotten, I guess, fairly good at drawing stuff in PowerPoint.
Very good. Let me go to the chat real quick. We've got, okay if we go a little bit longer, Bryce, where we've got a lot of questions. Yeah, okay, good. Let's see. So I've got a question from Walter. Isn't simple soil actually, let's see, I didn't see that. I can't see the whole question. Oh, let's see. Do you need more water for simple, if you go soilless? That was the question.
It depends. Not necessarily, because you can cycle the water through. You can recirculate the water. So you might have more water initially, but you could recycle it in a lot of the different scenarios. Aeroponics, hydroponics, deep water, shallow water, right? You can cycle the water back. Deep water hydroponics is the one that takes the most water of any of the hydroponic systems, right? But soil, as he points out, right, the reason the plains have a lot of drought-resistant crops is because of the mycorrhizae in the soils, right? The funguses, right? So all the Great Plains that were all grass systems even before they're now different kinds of grasses, but back when it was just buffalo and other grasses, right? Tall grasses and other grasses, right? The reason it was resistant to drought was because of the soil constituency, right? The bacteria and funguses in the soil make the plants drought resistant. So as he points out, yes, you could theoretically use a little bit less water, but the water still has to be accumulated in the tissues of the plant. The plant still has to transpire. There ain't no way around that part, right? So even in a hydroponic system, it's still got to do that, right? In the soil, it's still got to do that, but you might have less residence in the soil versus in some deep water hydroponic bucket, right? But that's a trade-off, is how much initial water do you start with, right? And it takes time to make soil. Soil doesn't just happen instantly. Like if you're going to go, let's say I wanted to go soil, right, for my grow, then I'm going to have to bring out a culture for the soil, essentially a living soil culture that I keep alive in transit all the way there. And then I start spreading it out, and then I start taking a lot of my waste mass and start building it in to make the matrix in the soil and take some of my in situ mass to do that. But that means that I've got to replace that carbon too. So Mars, that would work great. Mars could become a great agricultural powerhouse, right? Because it has a giant carbon dioxide atmosphere and a lot of dirt and a lot of water up at the poles, and you could probably suck it out of the air somewhat too, right? So, you know, if you have that and then you combine it with some cheap way of getting mass to orbit, like a space elevator or something, if you're thinking really long future, then Mars could become a giant agricultural powerhouse for the entire outer solar system, right? Because of that very thing, because you can make soil. You could make giant soil farms on Mars and then condense in all the carbon dioxide you want to replace the mass lost by shipping it away.
Very good. I've got a couple of observations here that they're not necessarily questions, but if you'd like to comment on them. One's coming from Bill. He says, my wine cap mushrooms planted in spring for fall have not yet sprouted, yet I am here on Earth.
I have very little good experience with mushrooms. I have a lot of bad experience with funguses, but not a lot of good ones. It makes them feel better. Mushrooms are an enigma to me too. Yeast, I know how to do. I know how to do yeast. I know how to make mead. I know how to make wine. I know how to make sake, and I know how to make beer. Perfect. Got it down. Right.
Very good.
But mushrooms, them are hard.
Well, Bill is seeing that, I guess. Another question, well, it's a comment from one of our NSS colleagues, Hoyt Davidson. Interesting that the food timeline for space settlement is exactly opposite of human food diet evolution on Earth. Hunters of big game, gatherers of fruits and nuts, growing of grains, then tomatoes, now it's salads and vegetables, heading toward microorganisms. Interesting.
He's got a fair point. We want an interesting note on that, though. Even hunter-gatherers still had a lot of people go grabbing vegetable matter to add to those things too. So a meat and fiber diet, oh yeah, that's how it starts. But he's right. He goes eventually, yeah, you might be looking at some kind of mycoculture with some cellular agriculture with a whole bunch of really cool 3D printers and spice plants. I don't know, but me, I would like to know. I would like to watch things grow. If I was on a settlement, I'd want to see plants, right? Just saying. I just want to see greenery growing because it's good for the mind. So, but he's right. It's the reverse of what's happened on Earth. Yes.
Got a question from Carrie. She said, fantastic presentation. She's working on an educational experience on space botany for high schoolers. Are there any resources you might recommend to further her research?
Oh, man. So, as I said, O'Neill's trying to think of what the book's called. I have it sitting right behind me. He has a great book. I mean, a lot of that work is really done in the 70s and 80s on a lot of space botany stuff, right? So there's a lot of good work there. And then anything that's come out of, so there is some botany work that's come out of NASA recently, right? You can just search it up and find it. And then there's a lot of botany work that came out of high seas and from the biosphere effort.
Very good.
So those are things I would look at, but I wouldn't just restrict myself to that. Like I said, if I were her, I would also look strongly at vertical farms, right? So there's tons of vertical farm effort. Here's a bit of trivia for a lot of people. So as I said, Northern Europe get most of their off-season tomatoes from vertical farms, right? Off-season tomatoes and lettuce because you can grow them locally. But in the US, some of that happens too, right? So you can get fresh tilapia, shrimp, and tomatoes and lettuce in some large cities from repurposed factories. Just saying. So I would encourage her to look at that resources as well.
Let's see, let me take just a few more questions, and we do have another hand raised. So I'm going to get one from Rich, who asked about, what about cultured meat and other types of cultured food that are being developed?
So yeast solids are definitely, I think you're going to have a purpose for yeast solids no matter what, right? No matter how complex your farm gets, you're not going to ever get away, I don't think, from yeast solids just because they're a good food additive, if nothing else, to make things taste interesting, right? So that's one kind of culture. But like you said, the cellular cultured meat, as I said before, can get a little wonky if there's any radiation or viral infection. But if you manage the cultures ideally, yeah, eventually you could 3D print whatever, right? You could 3D print your perfect steak. So I'm not saying there's not a purpose for it, but I do see a very strong purpose for using algae and yeast, right? If nothing else is a backup, right? Even if you don't feed them to fish, even if you have a perfect garden going on and you really don't care to produce any yeast, right? You still will have them, I think, as a backup food source in case everything else fails, right? Because you could live indefinitely until you get a resupply then, right? You still can use that cellular culture to survive, right? But you get benefits from having things like algae additives and yeast additives, right? They're very good for injecting different nutritional components into the diet, right? Algae is really good for dressings, if nothing else. Kombucha, for example, right? And I think cellular culture to produce yeast is huge, but the other big reason for cellular culture, this is the one sort of leaning towards what my brother does for a living, as I think settlements are going to need cellular culture to produce pharmaceuticals. right? So producing various biochemicals that they're going to need to survive, because you're going to be a long way away from anywhere that's going to give it to you, right? So there is a very big purpose for cellular cultures just for producing the pharmaceuticals, vaccines, whatever, right? Just for medical purposes, if nothing else.
Right. Let's see. Last question that was, I'm going to take that was submitted, then we'll ask that we'll get that one hand that's raised from Larry. So this is from Robert. Are you assuming typical terrestrial levels of productivity? Would raising the CO2 level in the farm help?
Yes. Yes. It depends. So some of my analysis has assumed the highest productivity you would get in soil, right? As I use that as an initial starting point to try to make calculations. And being the Missourian I am, I get pessimistic from there, right? So hydroponically, you lose a lot of space advantage, but you might get more productivity per plant per se, but you're probably going to lose some of the volume because you have to, of course, make the trays and walk around them and stuff, right? So you lose a little bit of footprint that way. But I assume I'll start with the published agricultural levels and work backwards, work usually downhill from those, right, to assume for productivity levels. But there is tons of published work on, of course, the grains especially. The big commercial crops, there's tons of work on that. And as I said, I go negative from there, right? I get pessimistic from there because that's just how I am, right? So I will start those kind of figures and work backwards. So what was the other half of that question?
It was just about raising the CO2 level, and would it help? And you said yes. Yes.
So it depends. So some plants, yes, some plants, maybe not. So some plants, if you raise the CO2 level too high, you end up with a lot of greenery and no fruit, right? Some plants, if you raise it just the right amount, yes, you increase productivity, right? So for some plants, you might actually have the CO, if you really want to be productive, the CO2 level might be high enough that the humans might need to wear a mask to work on the plants, right? For some very particular plants, right? But for most of them, you could raise it just enough not to asphyxiate the humans, but higher than it would be, let's say, on sea level Earth. And yes, you do get a benefit to a certain point, but we don't honestly, that's research that we have to do. The other weird thing about raising CO2 levels is that means you have to increase the oxygen to the roots. So you already have to oxygenate the hydroponic water that you feed into the roots, right? You have to inject oxygen into that for them to be productive, right? For the root biome. So if you raise the CO2 level, you also have to raise the oxygen level going to the roots too. And I don't know where that balance is. That's research that needs to be done.
Very good. I want to get one more question before I go to you, Larry, because this one's kind of interesting. What about, this is from Carl, what about cotton for clothes?
Well, that comes under the non-edible crops. So another crop that's been proposed is bamboo, right? So bamboo is interesting. The problem with cotton, and man, I just saw a ton of it today, right? I drove right through northern Alabama into Tennessee, and I saw the current cotton crop for this week, right? And cotton is sort of like a legume, right? It produces a ball, but then you have a ton of plant mass that goes with it. And I mean a ton of, they call it silage, right? So you get the ball of fiber, but then you have a ton of other fiber that's with it. My thought is if you want to do clothes, you already have vegetable wastes from other plants, and it's not that hard to chemically turn that into cellulose fibers directly instead of using cotton. That's just my 2 cents. But if you feel like you want to maybe lab grow some cotton, maybe you can get cotton as direct assembly, right? Using cellular ag, it's possible. You could probably get cellulose that way just fine. In fact, you want a weird scenario, there are bugs that you can use to turn plastics into, but you can genetically engineer insects to do things like that.
Very
right,
good.
to produce you fibers that you turn into clothes. But I would suggest you taking plant cellulose and just chemically processing it to turn into new clothing. Just me.
It's a good question. Last question goes to you, Larry. You have your hand raised, so go ahead.
Yeah, I got two things. Number one, I love that graphic behind you. I like to get a copy of that. I just love that graphic.
And Larry, I'll send it to you.
Okay, and the second thing is
I put a copyright thing on there, but that doesn't apply to the NSS. Anything the NSS wants to do or you want to do with it, knock yourself out.
Okay, the one thing I've observed like this is soybeans. Somebody just went to one of my nieces or nephews just came back and says, "Oh, look I got a hamburger. It's all plant. It's made from soybeans, I guess." Well, I forgot what fast food place like that. But the thing is, if you want a steak like that, if you're growing soy, but you'll probably get something that passes for a steak or something, just using plants, I guess. Tell me I'm wrong.
Soybeans are, if you can get, the problem with soybeans is they require a lot of inputs to get the bean, right? Even though they're very efficient nowadays, right? The soy crop we have now is not the soy crop you had in the 50s, right? Not even close, right? Our soybeans are very efficient, right? Especially for where they're grown. But one of the big reasons for soy isn't necessarily just the food you eat straight off, but the oils, right? If you need an oil crop to produce cooking oil or other purposes for other kinds of oils, soybeans are wonderful for that, right? But you're right, you can do a ton with soybean protein, right? Soy protein can be used 1,000 different ways. Just the only thing, if you're going to be a guy and eat soybeans, is you probably ought to boil it first. Boil it and then dry it or roast it because of the esterols. But beyond that, yeah, soybeans are definitely a Swiss Army knife crop, right? Once you can get them to grow them, you can use them for 1,000 things.
Yeah, but my problem is I'm old enough to tell it. So I can tell the difference between a soy hamburger and real meat. And the thing is,
I can definitly do that. In fact,
yeah,
here's one I'll tell you.
That's easy to do. Yep.
These kids nowadays, they don't know the difference, so it's possible.
I can tell the difference I can tell you the difference in beef between grass-fed and non-grass-fed.
Wow.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Bryce. That was a really fun, informative presentation. We really appreciate taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. I know everyone enjoyed it. Looking at the comments, what I've done is I've saved the chat, so I'll be able to pass that on to you just to see what some of the other comments and questions are. So as always, again, thank you to our great presenter tonight, Bryce Meyer, also one of our NSS colleagues, and you're doing great things. So thanks so much. And I would like to again thank Fred Becker, who as always works behind the scenes, making sure our tech is working. So thank you so much, Fred. And my colleague, Larry Ahern, the scheduler for these space forums. And we appreciate that, Larry. So again, what I'm going to do now is share my screen real quick, just to say goodnight to everybody. And we appreciate all the comments and questions you had. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. We went a few minutes over, and that's great because we can try to accommodate as many as we could. But thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much for the questions and participating. We want to see you next week on the 4th. And kind of a continuation of this one, talking about food and space as well. So thank you for attending. Have a great evening if you're in these time zones, a great day if you're in tomorrow's time zone, and a great weekend. And stay safe, everybody. So we'll see you next week. Take care.